November 30th, 1939. Dawn breaks over the frozen forests of Finland. The temperature hovers at -40 degrees Celsius. Along the entire 1,600-kilometer border, Soviet artillery opens fire. The barrage is deafening, relentless, terrifying. 500,000 Red Army soldiers begin their invasion, supported by thousands of tanks and hundreds of aircraft. They outnumber the Finnish defenders 5-1. They have overwhelming superiority in every category of military power. Moscow confidently expects the war to be over in 2 weeks. Soviet commanders have already planned their victory parade in Helsinki. 105 days later, the Soviet Union will have suffered one of the most humiliating defeats in military history. Over 300,000 Soviet casualties, dead, wounded, captured, or missing. Entire divisions destroyed. Hundreds of tanks captured or destroyed. The myth of Red Army invincibility shattered forever. And the world will have learned a new Finnish word, Sisu, a concept meaning extraordinary determination, resilience, and courage in the face of overwhelming adversity. This is the story of the Winter War, when a nation of 3.7 million people stood against a totalitarian superpower of 170 million. When farmers, teachers, and factory workers became military legends. When the frozen hell of the Finnish winter became the ultimate weapon. When David faced Goliath in the snow, and Goliath bled like never before. This is the story of Finland's icy nightmare, a battle that shocked the world and changed the course of history. To understand the Winter War, we must first understand Finland itself, a nation forged between empires, shaped by unforgiving geography and centuries of hardship, tempered by foreign domination, yet never broken in spirit. Finland sits at the northern edge of Europe, a land of endless coniferous forests and literally thousands of lakes. It's a place where winter dominates for half the year, where temperatures plunge to extremes that can kill an unprepared person in minutes, where during the darkest months the sun barely rises above the horizon. For 6 centuries, from the Middle Ages until 1809, Finland was ruled by Sweden, its culture and people shaped by Swedish law and Lutheran Christianity, yet maintaining their own distinct language and identity. Then in 1809, following Sweden's defeat in the Finnish War, the Russian Empire seized control, making Finland a Grand Duchy under the Tsar. Under Russian rule, Finland maintained considerable autonomy, its own legal system, its own currency, its own government administration. Finnish culture survived and even flourished. The Finnish language, which had been suppressed under Swedish rule, was revived and celebrated. Finnish nationalism grew stronger with each passing decade. But true independence, real sovereignty and self-determination, seemed impossible as long as the Russian Empire stood. Then came 1917, and everything changed. Revolution tore through Russia like wildfire. The Tsar was overthrown in March. The provisional government that replaced him proved weak and indecisive. In November, the Bolsheviks under Lenin seized power in a violent coup. Russia descended into chaos, civil war, economic collapse, starvation, and anarchy spreading across the vast empire. In this chaos, on December 6, 1917, the Finnish parliament declared independence. It was a bold, risky move. Finland had no real army, no international recognition, no guarantee that Russia, whether Bolshevik or white, would accept the loss of this strategically important territory. But surprisingly, Lenin recognized Finnish independence on December 31, 1917. He had more pressing concerns. Civil war was erupting across Russia, and the Bolsheviks needed to consolidate their power in the heartland before worrying about the periphery. Finland was free for the first time in recorded history. But freedom came at a terrible, bloody price. In January 1918, just weeks after independence, Finland descended into civil war. Whites against Reds, nationalists and conservatives against communists and socialists. A brutal conflict that would scar the nation for generations. The White forces, led by General Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim, a former officer in the Russian Imperial Army who had returned to Finland to lead the independence movement, represented conservative nationalists, landowners, the middle class, and those who wanted Finland aligned with Germany and the West. The Red forces, supported by Soviet Russia, represented industrial workers, landless laborers, and those who wanted Finland to become a socialist state allied with the Bolsheviks. The Finnish Civil War was short but extraordinarily brutal. It lasted only 3.5 months, but killed over 36,000 people in a nation of just 3 million, roughly 1% of the entire population. Battles were fought in cities and forests. Prisoners were executed. Civilians were caught in the crossfire. Red prisoners were held in camps where thousands died of disease and starvation. The Whites won decisively, aided by German troops and weapons, but the psychological scars ran deep. Finnish society was divided, traumatized, suspicious. The Soviet Union, born from the same revolutionary chaos that had given Finland its independence, never forgot that Finnish communists had fought and lost. Soviet leaders viewed Finland as unfinished business, a piece of the old Russian Empire that had broken away but rightfully belonged under Moscow's control. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, as Stalin consolidated his totalitarian grip on the Soviet Union through terror, purges, and forced collectivization that killed millions, Finland nervously watched its massive neighbor. The Soviets had never truly accepted Finnish independence. Soviet maps often showed the border between Finland and the USSR positioned much farther west than it actually was, as if cartographic imagination could reshape reality. Soviet propaganda constantly spoke of liberating Finnish workers from capitalist oppression, of the inevitable triumph of communism, of the historical destiny that would reunite Finland with the Soviet Union. Soviet agents worked to undermine Finnish democracy, to support communist movements, to prepare the ground for eventual absorption. Finland prepared as best it could with limited resources. Under the continued leadership of Marshal Mannerheim, now Finland's most respected military figure, the Finns built defensive fortifications along the Karelian Isthmus, the narrow strip of land between the massive Lake Ladoga and the Gulf of Finland. This was the most obvious invasion route, flat enough for tanks, close to Leningrad, the traditional path that armies had used for centuries when attacking between Russia and Sweden. These fortifications became known as the Mannerheim Line. But calling it a line was charitable, almost misleading. The Finns had almost no money for defense. The entire Finnish defense budget was smaller than what major powers spent on a single battleship. The Mannerheim Line consisted of concrete bunkers, trenches, anti-tank obstacles fashioned from logs and boulders, dragon's teeth barriers, and fortified positions dug into rocky hillsides and forest clearings. But it was pathetically weak compared to the fortifications that wealthier nations had built. France's Maginot Line consisted of massive underground fortresses with elevators, rail systems, hospitals, and enough supplies to withstand siege for months. Czechoslovakia's border fortifications were engineering marvels of reinforced concrete and interlocking fields of fire. The Mannerheim Line had 168 fortified positions. France had thousands. Finland's bunkers were made of concrete and logs, when they had concrete at all, which was rare. Many positions had no heat despite temperatures that could drop to -40 Celsius or colder. They had no electricity. They had minimal supplies. They were, in military terms, barely adequate. But the Finns had something else, something that couldn't be measured in concrete or steel. They had terrain. The Karelian Isthmus was a nightmare landscape for conventional military operations. Dense coniferous forests covered most of the region, forests so thick that visibility was measured in meters, where entire units could pass within shouting distance without seeing each other. Between the forests lay swamps. In summer, they were impassable quagmires. In winter, they froze solid but remained dangerous, with hidden weak spots where the ice could give way. Thousands of lakes, large and small, dotted the landscape. Rocky hills and ridges provided defensive positions. River valleys channeled movement into predictable routes that could be defended or ambushed, and they had motivation that transcended normal military discipline. Every Finnish soldier, from the highest-ranking officer to the youngest conscript, understood exactly what was at stake. This wasn't about territory or resources or abstract ideological principles. This was about survival, national survival, cultural survival, perhaps even physical survival. If the Soviet Union conquered Finland, Finnish independence would end forever. Finnish democracy would be replaced by Stalin's totalitarian dictatorship. Finnish culture might be systematically destroyed, as Stalin was destroying cultures across the Soviet Union. Many Finns feared deportations to Siberian labor camps, mass executions, the same terror that Stalin had unleashed on his own people during the Great Purge of 1936 to 1938, when nearly 1 million Soviet citizens were shot and millions more were sent to the Gulag. The Finns also had leadership. Marshal Mannerheim was 72 years old in 1939, but his experience was invaluable. He had served 30 years in the Russian Imperial Army, fighting in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 and World War I, rising to the rank of lieutenant general. He understood how the Russian military thought, how it operated, its strengths and weaknesses. He spoke fluent Russian. He had traveled extensively across Asia on an intelligence-gathering expedition for the Tsar. He was an aristocrat by birth, a cavalry officer by training, but he had earned the respect of ordinary Finns through his leadership during the Civil War and his dedication to building Finland's defenses during the interwar years. By 1939, war was coming and everyone knew it. The signs were unmistakable, ominous, increasingly urgent. In August 1939, Hitler and Stalin stunned the world by signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a cynical agreement between the two totalitarian powers to divide Eastern Europe between them. The pact included secret protocols that assigned Finland to the Soviet sphere of influence. Poland was invaded in September and carved up between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, were forced at gunpoint to accept Soviet military bases on their territory, the first step toward their complete occupation and annexation. Now Stalin turned his attention to Finland. The Soviet demands were presented to the Finnish government as negotiations, as reasonable requests for minor border adjustments to improve Leningrad's security. But everyone understood they were ultimatums backed by overwhelming force. Stalin wanted Finland to cede substantial territory on the Karelian Isthmus, pushing the border farther from Leningrad. He wanted to lease the Hanko Peninsula on Finland's southern coast for 30 years to establish a Soviet naval base controlling the Gulf of Finland. He wanted several strategic islands. In exchange, he offered a larger but almost worthless piece of Soviet Karelia farther north. Frozen wilderness with no population, no resources, no value except on a map. The Finnish government refused. They debated extensively, argued internally, sought advice from military leaders and foreign diplomats. Some Finnish politicians wanted to accept the Soviet demands, arguing that resistance was futile against such overwhelming power. But most understood the historical precedent. Look at the Baltic states. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania had accepted similar Soviet demands in 1939, allowing Soviet military bases on their territory in exchange for promises of continued independence. By the summer of 1940, all three had been completely occupied by the Red Army and forcibly annexed into the Soviet Union. Their governments were dissolved. Their leaders were arrested or fled. Mass deportations began. Independence was erased. The Finns understood that if they gave Stalin an inch, he would take everything. Soviet military bases on Finnish soil would be the end of genuine independence. Soviet troops would control key strategic points. Soviet political pressure would become irresistible. Within months, perhaps within weeks, Finland would go the way of the Baltic states, swallowed whole by the Soviet Empire. Negotiations dragged on through October and November 1939. Finnish diplomats traveled repeatedly to Moscow, meeting with Stalin and Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov. Each time, the Soviets increased their demands. Each time, the Finns looked for compromise but refused to surrender their sovereignty. Stalin grew increasingly impatient and angry. He had already divided up Poland with Hitler. He had forced the Baltic states to submit. Only Finland remained defiant. It was intolerable to the Soviet dictator, an insult to Soviet power, a challenge to his authority that could not be allowed to stand. The Soviet military began massing troops along the entire Finnish border. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, thousands of tanks, artillery units, Air Force squadrons. The buildup was impossible to hide. Finnish intelligence reported the movements. Foreign diplomats in Moscow and Helsinki sent urgent cables. The world watched nervously as the crisis escalated. Then, on November 26, 1939, the Soviets manufactured a provocation. They claimed that Finnish artillery had shelled the Soviet village of Mainila, killing several Red Army soldiers. It was a transparent fabrication. The Manila incident, as it became known, was almost certainly a false flag operation staged by the Soviets themselves to provide a pretext for war. Finnish artillery positions were too far from Manila to have reached it. Finnish guns didn't have the range. The entire story was nonsense. But truth didn't matter. Stalin had decided that Finland would submit or be destroyed. On November 30th, 1939, without a declaration of war, the Soviet Union launched a massive invasion across the entire length of the Finnish-Soviet border. The Soviet plan was simple, overwhelming, and confident. Multiple army groups would attack simultaneously. The main assault would come on the Karelian Isthmus, where the 7th Army and 13th Army, with over 450,000 troops and over 2,000 tanks, would smash through the Mannerheim Line and drive to Helsinki. In the north, the 8th Army and 9th Army would cut Finland in half, capturing key cities and rail lines. The Soviet Air Force would establish immediate air superiority, bombing Finnish cities into submission. The Finnish government would collapse. The war would be over by mid-December, in time for victory celebrations before the new year. Soviet commanders were supremely confident. They had studied maps and intelligence reports. They had overwhelming numerical and material superiority. What could a small, poor country like Finland possibly do against the might of the Soviet Union? Soviet soldiers were issued summer uniforms despite the approaching Finnish winter. The thinking was they wouldn't need winter gear because they'd be in heated buildings in Helsinki before the worst cold arrived. Some Soviet units brought brass bands and dress uniforms for the victory parade. Political officers prepared proclamations about liberating Finnish workers from capitalist oppression. The Finns had approximately 180,000 soldiers when the war began, though this would grow to over 300,000 as reserves were mobilized. But they were desperately short of everything. They had almost no tanks, a few dozen obsolete models purchased from other countries or captured during the Civil War. They had no anti-tank guns worth mentioning. Their artillery was a mixture of old weapons from various sources, with limited ammunition. The Finnish Air Force had fewer than 150 aircraft, most of them obsolete. Against the Soviet Air Force's thousands of modern planes, Finnish pilots would be hopelessly outnumbered. What Finland did have was preparation, determination, and an intimate knowledge of the terrain. Every Finnish soldier had trained for this moment. They knew the forests, lakes, and hills where they would fight. They knew how to move silently on skis, how to navigate in darkness, how to survive in extreme cold. They knew how to use the terrain as a weapon, channeling Soviet columns into kill zones, disappearing into forests after ambushes, striking from unexpected directions. And they had that intangible quality, Sisu. It's difficult to translate precisely. Determination doesn't quite capture it. Neither does courage or resilience. Sisu is something deeper, a refusal to give up even when giving up seems rational, a willingness to endure suffering beyond normal human limits, a stubborn defiance of fate itself. Finnish soldiers would need every ounce of Sisu they possessed in the 100 days of winter hell that was about to begin. When the Soviet invasion began on November 30th, the initial bombardment was overwhelming. Soviet artillery pounded Finnish positions all along the border. The earth shook. Trees exploded into splinters. Men died in their bunkers as shells penetrated weak roofs or collapsed walls. The psychological impact was immense. The sheer noise and violence of thousands of artillery pieces firing simultaneously, the helplessness of being under bombardment with no way to strike back. Then came the tanks. Soviet armor rolled forward in massive columns. T-26 light tanks, BT fast tanks, heavy T-28 medium tanks. They looked unstoppable, steel monsters that could crush obstacles, survive rifle fire, destroy defensive positions with their guns. Finnish soldiers with no anti-tank weapons watched in horror as these mechanical beasts approached. But the Soviets were about to learn several harsh lessons about winter warfare in Finland. First, Soviet tactics were rigid and predictable. Red Army doctrine emphasized mass, firepower, and overwhelming force. Soviet units advanced in dense columns along roads because cross-country movement was difficult with heavy equipment. They made no effort at concealment or deception. They announced their presence with artillery barges and brass bands. They camped in the open rather than dispersing. They assumed that Finnish forces, being vastly outnumbered, would simply retreat or surrender. Instead, the Finns fought with cunning and ferocity. Finnish soldiers, wearing white snow camouflage, moved silently on skis through the forests. They would allow Soviet columns to advance deep into Finnish territory, then attack from multiple directions simultaneously, cutting the columns into segments, isolating units, preventing reinforcement or retreat. These encirclement tactics, which the Finns called Modi warfare after a Finnish word for a bundle of logs, would become devastating. Finnish ski troops could cover enormous distances quickly. Crews that escaped the flames often couldn't survive in the extreme cold without their vehicles' shelter. Hundreds of Soviet tanks were destroyed this way. Third, Soviet logistics were catastrophically unprepared for the conditions. The Red Army had planned for a quick campaign. Supply depots were positioned on the Soviet side of the border. Transportation infrastructure was minimal. When the two-week war turned into weeks and then months of grinding combat, Soviet supply lines stretched impossibly thin. Food became scarce. Ammunition ran low. Medical supplies were inadequate. Winter clothing, critical for survival in Arctic conditions, barely existed. Soviet soldiers suffered horribly. They wore standard uniforms designed for mild autumn weather, not Arctic winter. They had summer boots, not insulated winter boots. Many had no gloves, no proper hats, no white camouflage. They stood out in the snow like dark targets. Frostbite claimed more Soviet soldiers than Finnish bullets in some sectors. Men froze to death at their posts. Wounded soldiers who couldn't be evacuated quickly froze within hours. Soviet camps were disasters. Tents provided minimal shelter against temperatures that regularly dropped below -30°C. Campfires could be seen for miles, making them easy targets for Finnish artillery or ski patrols. Food froze solid and had to be thawed over fires before it could be eaten. Water froze in canteens. Even basic hygiene became impossible. Disease spread rapidly through densely packed units. Dysentery, pneumonia, typhus, and other illnesses that weakened men already suffering from cold and hunger. Fourth, Soviet tactics showed a shocking disregard for the lives of their own soldiers. This reflected both Stalin's general callousness toward human life and the specific military doctrine that the Red Army had developed. Mass was everything. Casualties were acceptable, even expected. If one wave of attackers was destroyed, send another wave. If that wave failed, send a third. Eventually, the enemy would run out of ammunition or be overwhelmed by sheer numbers. This led to scenes of almost incomprehensible brutality and waste. Soviet infantry would advance in dense formations across open ground toward Finnish positions. Finnish machine gunners would mow them down in rows. The survivors would advance over the bodies of their comrades. Finnish defenders, even while killing dozens or hundreds of attackers, felt a kind of horror at the systematic slaughter, at the way Soviet commanders kept sending men forward like machines rather than human beings. Soviet tanks would advance without infantry support, making them easy targets for Finnish infantry with Molotov cocktails or satchel charges. When the tanks were destroyed, infantry would be sent forward without tank support, making them easy targets for Finnish machine guns. Coordination between arms, tank, infantry, artillery working together was almost non-existent. Each element fought separately, allowing Finnish defenders to defeat them piecemeal. Political commissars and Soviet units enforced Stalin's brutal discipline. Soldiers who retreated without orders could be shot. Officers who failed in their missions faced arrest and execution. This created a culture of fear that stifled initiative and tactical flexibility. Soviet commanders followed orders regardless of circumstances, even when those orders made no military sense, because failure to obey meant death or the Gulag. The Finnish defenders, by contrast, operated with remarkable flexibility and initiative. Finnish officers and NCOs were allowed to make tactical decisions based on the situation they faced. If an attack seemed unwise, they could wait or try a different approach. If an opportunity presented itself, they could exploit it without waiting for orders from higher headquarters. This decentralized command structure, combined with soldiers who knew the terrain intimately, gave the Finns an enormous advantage. Finnish defensive tactics on the Karelian Isthmus followed a consistent pattern. The Mannerheim Line's forward positions were lightly held, just enough troops to detect and slow Soviet advances. When Soviet attacks began, Finnish defenders would fight briefly, then retreat to secondary positions. Soviet forces would advance, thinking they were achieving victory. Then they would encounter the main defensive line, prepared positions with interlocking fields of fire, pre-registered artillery coordinates, minefields, and tank obstacles. Soviet attacks would bog down. The Finns would inflict heavy casualties. If Soviet forces achieved a local breakthrough, Finnish reserves would counterattack immediately, often at night, to restore the line. This defense in depth, combined with the difficult terrain and extreme cold, turned every kilometer of Soviet advance into a battle of attrition that the Soviets, despite their numbers, couldn't afford. In early December 1939, the world watched in amazement as tiny Finland held off the Soviet colossus. International sympathy for Finland was enormous. In Britain, France, and the United States, newspapers published stories about Finnish courage and Soviet brutality. Volunteers from multiple countries tried to reach Finland to join the fight. Swedes, Norwegians, Americans, Britons, even some Germans who opposed Hitler and saw Finland's fight as a stand against totalitarianism. Material support began flowing to Finland. Sweden, officially neutral but culturally close to Finland, provided weapons, ammunition, and volunteers. Britain and France considered sending expeditionary forces, though these plans never materialized. The United States, also officially neutral, extended credit and allowed weapons purchases. It wasn't nearly enough to match Soviet production, but it helped keep Finnish forces supplied when their own limited stocks ran dangerously low. The Soviet Union responded to these early failures with fury and determination. Stalin was personally humiliated. The quick victory he had promised was not materializing. Instead, the Red Army looked incompetent and weak. This had serious implications. Hitler was watching carefully, and every Soviet failure in Finland encouraged Nazi Germany to view the Soviet Union as a potential target. Stalin couldn't afford to appear weak. In early December, Stalin replaced the commander of the Leningrad military district and brought in Marshal Semyon Timoshenko, one of the Red Army's most capable commanders, to take overall control of operations against Finland. Massive reinforcements were sent to the front. More tanks, more artillery, more aircraft, more troops. Eventually, over 1 million Soviet soldiers would be committed to the Finnish front, but the most important changes were tactical. Timoshenko recognized that Soviet tactics had been disastrous. He ordered a complete operational pause to reorganize, retrain, and prepare for a properly planned offensive. Soviet units were withdrawn from the front lines to rear areas. Winter clothing was finally distributed, though it came too late for thousands who had already died of cold. Units practiced combined arms tactics, infantry, tanks, and artillery working together. Artillery officers studied Finnish defensive positions and planned systematic bombardments. The Finns used this operational pause to rest and reinforce their battered units, but they knew it was temporary. The storm was being prepared, and when it came, it would be far more dangerous than the initial chaotic Soviet assaults. While the Karelian Isthmus saw massive battles between large formations, the war in central and northern Finland took on a completely different character. Here, geography and climate dominated everything. This was the land of the midnight sun in summer and polar night in winter, a vast expanse of forests, lakes, and wilderness stretching hundreds of kilometers with minimal roads and almost no infrastructure. Soviet strategy in the north was to cut Finland in half. The Eighth Army would advance west from Soviet Karelia to the Gulf of Bothnia, severing northern Finland from the south. The Ninth Army would capture key cities and rail lines. If successful, this would trap Finnish forces, prevent reinforcement, and force surrender even if the Mannerheim Line held in the south. But the Soviets had sent their armies into a frozen hell. The terrain in central and northern Finland was so difficult that calling it roads was generous. They were dirt tracks through forests, passable in summer, barely negotiable in winter. Soviet columns stretched for kilometers, with no ability to maneuver off-road. Supply trucks and artillery pieces created massive traffic jams at every bottleneck. Movement was agonizingly slow, and all around them, invisible in the forests, Finnish ski troops waited. The Finns didn't try to defend everywhere. They couldn't, because they didn't have enough troops. Instead, They let Soviet columns advance deep into Finnish territory, far from their supply bases, strung out in long, vulnerable lines on the few roads that existed. Then the Finns struck. The Mahdi tactics that worked so well on the Karelian Isthmus were even more devastating in the north. Finnish ski troops would attack a Soviet column at multiple points simultaneously, cutting it into isolated segments called Mahdis, pockets surrounded by Finnish forces, cut off from supply and reinforcement, trapped in the wilderness. Soviet troops in a Mahdi were doomed unless they could break out or be rescued. Often, neither was possible. The most famous example was the destruction of the Soviet 44th Rifle Division at Rate Road in January 1940. The 44th Division, over 14,000 men strong with tanks and artillery, advanced along the only road through the wilderness toward the Finnish town of Suomussalmi. Finnish Colonel Jalmar Salasvuo, commanding a force only a fraction of the Soviet strength, cut the Soviet column into small pockets and systematically destroyed them over several weeks. The Battle of Rate Road became legendary. Finnish ski troops, moving silently through the forests, attacked at night when Soviet troops were most vulnerable. They captured Soviet supply depots, leaving the surrounded units without food or ammunition. They destroyed Soviet artillery and tanks with Molotov cocktails and captured anti-tank guns. They picked off Soviet soldiers with sniper fire, creating a constant state of terror and exhaustion. Soviet troops, already suffering from extreme cold and hunger, broke psychologically. When Finnish forces finally overran the last Soviet positions in early January, the scene was apocalyptic. Thousands of Soviet bodies frozen solid in the snow. Hundreds of vehicles, trucks, tanks, artillery pieces, abandoned or destroyed. Equipment, weapons, and supplies scattered across kilometers. Soviet soldiers had frozen to death in their fighting positions, at their guns, in their trenches. Some had tried to surrender, but froze before Finnish troops could reach them. Others had attempted to escape through the forests and died of exposure within hours. The Finns captured enormous quantities of equipment, over 40 tanks, dozens of artillery pieces, hundreds of trucks and vehicles, thousands of rifles, machine guns, and mortars, plus food, clothing, ammunition, and medical supplies. For the poorly equipped Finnish army, this captured Soviet equipment was invaluable. Some Finnish units ended up better armed with captured Soviet weapons than with their own Finnish-made equipment. Similar battles occurred across the northern front. At Suomussalmi, Kumo, Salla, and dozens of other engagements, Finnish troops surrounded and destroyed Soviet units with Mahdi tactics. The psychological impact was devastating. Soviet soldiers began to fear the forests, to see Finnish ghosts everywhere, to panic at any unexpected sound. Some Soviet units refused to advance farther into Finnish territory. Political commissars had to threaten soldiers with execution to force them forward. Finnish propaganda made the most of these victories. Stories of individual Finnish heroes spread throughout the nation and the world. There was Simo Haiha, the White Death, a Finnish sniper credited with over 500 kills during the Winter War, the deadliest sniper in military history. Haiha operated in temperatures of -40 Celsius. Using a bolt-action rifle without a telescopic sight, scopes could fog up or glint in sunlight, giving away position. Dressed in white camouflage, utterly invisible in the snow-covered forests. Soviet units put a price on his head and sent counter-sniper teams to hunt him. He survived the entire war, though he was badly wounded in the face during the final days. There were countless stories of small Finnish units achieving impossible victories through skill, courage, and intimate knowledge of the terrain. A squad of Finnish soldiers ambushing a Soviet company and escaping without casualties. A single Finnish machine gunner holding off an entire Soviet battalion. Finnish ski troops skiing dozens of kilometers through the night to attack Soviet headquarters and vanishing before dawn. These stories boosted Finnish morale enormously. But they couldn't change the fundamental strategic reality. Finland was running out of time, resources, and men. Every Finnish casualty was irreplaceable. The Finnish army couldn't trade losses with the Soviets. Are you enjoying this? Please like and subscribe. Every lost rifle, every expended artillery shell, every consumed ration was one fewer than what they started with, because Finnish production capacity was minimal and foreign supplies were insufficient. By late January 1940, the Finns were exhausted. Soldiers had been fighting continuously for 2 months in the most extreme conditions imaginable. Many units had never been rotated off the front line. Men were suffering from frostbite, exhaustion, illness, and malnutrition. Ammunition stocks were critically low. Artillery units had to ration shells, firing only at the most crucial targets. Food was scarce. Medical supplies were running out, and the Soviets were preparing their final offensive. Throughout January, Marshal Timoshenko assembled overwhelming force on the Karelian Isthmus. Over 600,000 troops, nearly 4,000 artillery pieces, the largest concentration of artillery in any war up to that point. Over 3,000 tanks. The Soviet Air Force concentrated over 1,000 aircraft. The plan was methodical and brutal: systematically destroy the Mannerheim Line through massed artillery bombardment, then push through with tanks and infantry in overwhelming numbers. The offensive began on February 1, 1940. The artillery bombardment was apocalyptic. For days, Soviet guns pounded Finnish positions. The earth shook continuously. Trees were shredded into splinters. Bunkers collapsed. Men went mad from the noise and concussion. Some Finnish positions were hit by thousands of shells. Defenders couldn't even raise their heads without being killed. When the bombardment lifted, Soviet tanks and infantry attacked. This time, Soviet tactics were better coordinated. Infantry followed closely behind tanks, protecting them from Finnish close assault teams. Artillery provided rolling barges in front of the advancing troops. Breakthrough forces were given clear objectives and pushed forward relentlessly. Soviet commanders accepted horrific casualties, thousands dead per day, but kept advancing. The Finnish defenders fought with desperate courage. They knew every meter of ground lost brought Soviet forces closer to Helsinki. They counterattacked whenever possible, trying to throw Soviet forces back. Finnish artillery, though vastly outnumbered, fired with deadly accuracy at Soviet concentrations. Finnish machine gunners fired until their barrels glowed red, then died at their guns rather than retreat. But slowly, meter by meter, the Mannerheim Line began to crack. Finnish units were ground down by attrition. Defensive positions that had held for weeks were overrun. Gaps opened in the line. Soviet forces poured through. Finnish reserves rushed forward to plug the gaps, counterattacked, briefly stabilized the line. Then the Soviet assault resumed with fresh troops, and the cycle repeated. By mid-February, the situation was critical. The Finnish government understood that military defeat was now inevitable. The question was whether they could negotiate terms before total collapse. They reached out through diplomatic channels to Sweden, Britain, France, and even Germany. Anyone who might pressure the Soviets to agree to peace rather than complete conquest. Stalin, seeing victory within grasp, but aware that the war had already cost the Soviet Union far more than expected in blood and international prestige, was willing to negotiate. The war had revealed serious weaknesses in the Red Army that Hitler was certainly noting. Soviet casualties were staggering. Estimates range from 300,000 to nearly 400,000 killed, wounded, missing, or captured. The Soviet Air Force had lost over 900 aircraft. Soviet prestige had suffered enormously. The myth of Red Army invincibility was shattered. Most importantly, the spring thaw was coming. In a few weeks, the frozen ground would become muddy swamp. Soviet tanks would be immobilized. Mechanized warfare would become impossible. The strategic advantage would shift back to the Finnish defenders who operated well in any conditions. Stalin wanted the war over before the mud season began. Negotiations began in Moscow in early March 1940. The Soviet terms were harsh, far harsher than the original demands that Finland had rejected the previous autumn. Now, having bled for 3.5 months, having proven their courage and skill, having inflicted enormous casualties on the Soviet invaders, the Finns had to accept much worse terms. The Moscow Peace Treaty was signed on March 12, 1940. Finland ceded the entire Karelian Isthmus, including Finland's second-largest city, Viipuri. Finland ceded territory around Lake Ladoga. Finland leased the Hanko Peninsula to the Soviet Union for 30 years for a naval base. Finland lost roughly 10% of its total territory and 20% of its industrial capacity. Over 400,000 Finnish civilians, virtually the entire population of the ceded territories, chose to evacuate rather than live under Soviet rule. They abandoned their homes, farms, businesses, everything they owned, and fled west into what remained of Finland. The Winter War officially ended on March 13, 1940, at 11 a.m. Along the front, Finnish and Soviet soldiers heard the ceasefire order and stopped shooting. Some Finns wept with relief, exhaustion, and grief. Others stood silent, looking at the forests and fields they had defended for 105 days at such terrible cost, now being handed to the Soviets. The human cost of the Winter War was staggering relative to Finland's small population. Finland suffered approximately 70,000 casualties, 25,000 killed, and 45,000 wounded. In a nation of 3.7 million, this meant that nearly every family had lost someone. Finnish society was traumatized. The economic cost was enormous. The lost territory included critical industrial facilities, hydroelectric dams, and agricultural land. But Finland had survived. Against all odds, against the overwhelming power of the Soviet Union, Finland had maintained its independence. The Finnish government, Finnish democracy, Finnish sovereignty continued to exist. Compare this to the Baltic states, which had accepted Soviet demands peacefully in 1939 and then ceased to exist as independent nations by summer 1940. Finland's choice to fight, however costly, had saved the nation. The Soviet Union paid a terrible price for its limited gains. Soviet casualties were catastrophic. Estimates range from 300,000 to 400,000 total casualties, with 127,000 to 167,000 killed. For comparison, this was more than the United States would lose in the entire Vietnam War. The Soviet Union lost over 900 aircraft, over 3,000 tanks and armored vehicles, and enormous quantities of other equipment. Soviet international prestige collapsed. The Red Army, which was supposed to be the most powerful military force in the world, had been humiliated by tiny Finland. Perhaps most importantly, the Winter War encouraged Hitler to attack the Soviet Union. German military intelligence had observed Soviet performance in Finland closely. They noted the rigid tactics, poor logistics, incompetent leadership, inadequate winter equipment, and horrific casualties. Hitler and his generals concluded that the Red Army, despite its size, was weak and vulnerable. This perception contributed directly to Hitler's decision to launch Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, the invasion of the Soviet Union that would become the most destructive military campaign in human history. Stalin understood the disaster he had created. In April 1940, he ordered a comprehensive review of Soviet military performance in Finland. The resulting reports were damning. They identified failures at every level: strategic planning, tactical doctrine, logistics, leadership, training, equipment. But Soviet ambitions toward Finland hadn't changed. Finnish military and political leaders understood that another Soviet attack was likely. The question was when, and whether Finland would face it alone again. This strategic anxiety drove Finland's controversial decision in 1941 to cooperate with Nazi Germany when Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, Finland saw an opportunity to reclaim its lost territories and to have a powerful ally against the Soviet threat. The Continuation War, as Finns called it, lasted from 1941 to 1944 and was in many ways even more complex and morally ambiguous than the Winter War. But that is another story. The Winter War itself, those 105 days from November 30th, 1939 to March 13th, 1940, stands alone as one of the most remarkable military conflicts of the 20th century. It was a war that defied expectations, that saw a nation of farmers, teachers, and workers transform into soldiers who achieved battlefield victories that military historians still study. It was a war where the frozen landscape became as deadly as any weapon, where temperatures that could kill in minutes became a tactical advantage for the prepared and a death sentence for the unprepared. The lessons of the Winter War extend beyond military tactics. It demonstrated the power of national cohesion and motivation. Finnish soldiers fought with such determination because they were defending their homes, their families, their way of life. Every soldier understood exactly what defeat would mean. This created a psychological force multiplier that no amount of Soviet artillery could overcome. It demonstrated the importance of tactical flexibility and initiative at all levels. Finnish officers and soldiers could make decisions based on the situation they faced rather than rigidly following orders regardless of circumstances. This allowed the Finns to exploit Soviet mistakes, to adapt to changing conditions, to seize opportunities that doctrine-bound Soviet forces missed. It demonstrated that technology and numbers, while important, are not determinative. The Soviet Union had overwhelming superiority in every measurable category of military power. Yet they achieved limited objectives at enormous cost. Finnish defenders, using simple weapons, improvised tactics, and knowledge of their terrain, inflicted disproportionate casualties and held off the invaders for months. The Winter War also revealed the critical importance of logistics in modern warfare. Soviet logistics failures, inadequate winter clothing, insufficient food and medical supplies, poor transportation infrastructure, cost the Red Army more casualties than Finnish weapons. Soldiers who freeze to death or die of disease are just as lost as soldiers killed in combat. An army that cannot feed itself, cannot move supplies forward, cannot evacuate its wounded, cannot sustain operations regardless of how many tanks and guns it possesses. And it demonstrated something about the human spirit, that people pushed to the edge of survival, facing impossible odds, defending what they love, can achieve extraordinary things. Finnish soldiers skiing through forests at -40°C to attack Soviet positions. Finnish machine gunners firing until their weapons failed or they died. Finnish civilians evacuating their homes rather than submit to Soviet rule. This is what Sisu means, not just courage or determination, but something deeper and more profound. Today, the Winter War is remembered differently in Finland, Russia, and the West. In Finland, it is a source of national pride and painful memory. Finns honor the soldiers who died defending their country. They commemorate the evacuees who lost their homes. They preserve the battlefields and fortifications as historical sites. The Winter War is taught in schools, remembered in annual ceremonies, woven into Finnish national identity. In Russia, the Winter War is less prominent in historical memory. Soviet casualties were so high and the strategic gains so limited that the war is somewhat embarrassing. During the Soviet era, official histories minimized Soviet failures and emphasized Soviet strength. Modern Russian historical treatments are more honest about the problems, but the Winter War remains overshadowed by the Great Patriotic War against Nazi Germany that followed in the West. The Winter War is often remembered as an inspiring story of the underdog defying the odds. Finnish resistance against Soviet aggression fit neatly into Cold War narratives about democracy versus totalitarianism. Even today, military historians study Finnish tactics, particularly the Mahti operations and the effective use of terrain and climate as force multipliers. Books, documentaries, and films continue to tell the story of the Winter War to new generations. The physical scars of the Winter War remain visible in Finland today. The Mannerheim Line bunkers and fortifications, though now on the Russian side of the border, are preserved as historical sites where tourists can visit. Museums throughout Finland display weapons, equipment, photographs, and artifacts from the war. Memorials honor the fallen. The evacuated regions, now part of Russia, retain Finnish names on maps even though Finns no longer live there. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of the Winter War is what it revealed about Finland itself. Before the war, Finland was seen internationally as a small, insignificant country on the edge of Europe, peripheral, vulnerable, easily dominated by its powerful neighbors. The Winter War changed this perception forever. Finland demonstrated strength, resilience, tactical brilliance, and unbreakable determination. The Finns proved they would fight for their independence with everything they had, that they would pay any price to remain free. This legacy shaped Finland's subsequent history. When the Continuation War began in 1941, Finns fought again to reclaim their lost territories. When that war ended in 1944 with an armistice that preserved Finnish independence but required Finland to expel German forces from Finnish Lapland, Finns fought yet again in the Lapland War. Throughout the Cold War, Finland maintained a careful balancing act, neutral but armed, friendly with the West but respectful of Soviet power, always prepared to defend itself if necessary. Modern Finland, prosperous, democratic, member of the European Union, consistently ranked among the happiest and most successful societies in the world, exists because of choices made in 1939. The choice to resist rather than submit. The choice to fight rather than surrender. The choice to endure terrible suffering rather than accept the loss of independence. Those choices, made by Finnish leaders and ordinary Finnish citizens in the dark winter of 1939 to 1940, echo through history. The Winter War was Finland's icy nightmare. 105 days of suffering, death, and destruction on a scale that pushed a small nation to the edge of collapse. But it was also Finland's finest hour, when a democracy faced totalitarian aggression and chose to fight, when ordinary people became extraordinary, when the frozen landscape became the stage for one of military history's greatest defensive campaigns. November 30th, 1939 to March 13th, 1940. 105 days. A nation of 3.7 million against a superpower of 170 million. Temperatures that could kill an unprepared person in minutes. Forests that became killing grounds. Soldiers who performed miracles of endurance and courage. The Soviets expected victory in 2 weeks. Instead, they got 105 days of winter hell. They got mighty battles where entire divisions were destroyed. They got White Death snipers and Molotov cocktail attacks. They got Finnish ski troops who materialized from the forests like ghosts, struck with devastating effect, and vanished before reinforcements could respond. They got Sisu, that untranslatable Finnish concept of determination beyond reason, of fighting when victory seems impossible, of refusing to surrender even when surrender seems rational. They got a nation that would not die, would not submit, would pay any price for independence. The battle that froze Europe. The Winter War. Finland's icy nightmare. A small nation stand against a totalitarian giant. A story of suffering and sacrifice. A story of tactical brilliance and extraordinary courage. A story that reminds us that the human spirit, properly motivated and properly led, can achieve impossible things even in the darkest winter. This has been the story of the Winter War. May we never forget the price of freedom, the cost of independence, and the extraordinary things ordinary people can do when defending what they love. May the fallen rest in peace. May the survivors be honored. May the lessons endure. The individual stories of the Winter War deserve to be told, because behind every statistic, every casualty figure, every battle report, there were real people with real lives, real families, real dreams that were cut short or forever changed by those 105 days of frozen hell. Consider Arne Juutalainen, a Finnish fighter pilot who became one of the war's top aces. Flying an obsolete Fokker D.XXI biplane against modern Soviet fighters, Juutalainen shot down 34 Soviet aircraft during the Winter War without being shot down himself. He would survive the war, continue fighting in the Continuation War, and ultimately be credited with over 90 aerial victories, making him one of the highest-scoring non-German fighter aces of World War II. But in December 1939, he was just a young pilot doing his duty, taking off day after day in skies filled with enemy aircraft, knowing that each mission might be his last. Consider the women of the Lada Svard organization, over 100,000 Finnish women who volunteered for auxiliary service during the war. They couldn't fight directly, but they served as nurses, drivers, cooks, telephone operators, and in countless other roles that freed men for combat duty. They worked in field hospitals under bombardment, treated horrific injuries with inadequate supplies, drove supply trucks through blizzards and artillery fire, operated communications networks that kept the army functioning. Some were killed by Soviet bombs or shells. All endured hardships that tested human endurance. Consider the doctors and medics who tried to save wounded soldiers in conditions that make modern medicine seem miraculous. Finnish field hospitals operated in tents and wooden buildings with minimal heat. Wounded men were evacuated on sleds pulled by horses or reindeer, bouncing over frozen roads for hours before reaching medical care. Surgeons operated by lamplight with basic instruments. Antibiotics barely existed. Blood transfusions were primitive. Frostbite injuries required amputation of fingers, toes, hands, feet, sometimes entire limbs. Doctors made terrible choices about who could be saved and who couldn't, knowing that limited supplies meant not everyone would survive. Consider the Soviet soldiers, often forgotten in narratives that focus on Finnish heroism. Many were conscripts, peasants, workers, young men who had no desire to invade Finland but were given no choice. They were told they were liberating Finnish workers from capitalist oppression. They were promised a quick victory and warm quarters. Instead, they were sent into a frozen nightmare for which they were completely unprepared. They suffered from cold, hunger, disease, and terror. But in December 1939, he was just a young pilot doing his duty, taking off day after day in a skies filled with enemy aircraft, knowing that each mission might be his last. Consider the women of the Lada Svard organization, over 100,000 Finnish women who volunteered for auxiliary service during the war. They couldn't fight directly, but they served as nurses, drivers, cooks, telephone operators, and in countless other roles that freed men for combat duty. They worked in field hospitals under bombardment, treated horrific injuries with inadequate supplies, drove supply trucks through blizzards and artillery fire, operated communications networks that kept the army functioning. Some were killed by Soviet bombs or shells. All endured hardships that tested human endurance. Consider the doctors and medics who tried to save wounded soldiers in conditions that make modern medicine seem miraculous. Finnish field hospitals operated in tents and wooden buildings with minimal heat. Wounded men were evacuated on sleds pulled by horses or reindeer, bouncing over frozen roads for hours before reaching medical care. Surgeons operated by lamplight with basic instruments. Antibiotics barely existed. Blood transfusions were primitive. Frostbite injuries required amputation of fingers, toes, hands, feet, sometimes entire limbs. Doctors made terrible choices about who could be saved and who couldn't, knowing that limited supplies meant not everyone would survive. Consider the Soviet soldiers, often forgotten in narratives that focus on Finnish heroism. Many were conscripts, peasants, workers, young men who had no desire to invade Finland but were given no choice. They were told they were liberating Finnish workers from capitalist oppression. They were promised a quick victory and warm quarters. Instead, they were sent into a frozen nightmare for which they were completely unprepared. They suffered from cold, hunger, disease, and terror. Many wanted to surrender but feared what their own officers and political commissars would do to them or their families. When they died far from home, in a war they didn't understand, for objectives that meant nothing to them personally. The environmental conditions of the Winter War were so extreme that they deserve special attention. -40°C is almost incomprehensible to people who live in moderate climates. At that temperature, exposed skin freezes in minutes. Breathing becomes painful as frigid air sears the lungs. Metal becomes brittle. Rubber cracks. Lubricants freeze solid. Engines won't start. Water freezes instantly. Even inside supposed shelter, without proper heating, people can die of hypothermia within hours. This has been the story of the Winter War, the battle that froze Europe, Finland's icy nightmare, and the triumph of Sisu over seemingly impossible odds. May we remember the fallen, honor the survivors, and never forget the lessons they taught us about courage, determination, and the price of freedom.